My Didactic presentation by Becky Bell. Here is the contents of my presentation. I'm going to start with the research, my first practice workshop, and then what I learned and how I applied it onto the next practice workshop. This process is repeated until the final workshop. On my Padlet, you can find some of my original ideas for the workshop and feedback from my peers. These are things that have not been included in the presentation. Starting off with some of the most fundamental research I looked through the entire Didactic and even CPP module is the Stephen Fowler rubber stamping book. In the book, Stephen goes through the process step by step on how to create a stamp and all the tools you need to do so. In this book, Stephen goes through the entire process of how he makes his stamps, and this starts with the basics and the materials you could use, and then even how to use them in a workshop or in a collaborative way. I thought this was a great starting point for my own didactic. Continuing with that research, I then found some of the ways that he puts his work into context is by creating patterns and then stamping them onto different mediums such as fabrics and stamps. This is something I wanted to include in my own workshop. I really like the idea of teaching others how to create the stamp, but also showing them different, more thoughtful ways the stamp can be used. This is some of the historical research I did for the pattern making element part of my workshop. After looking at the pattern making by Stephen Fowler, I then started looking at how pattern has been used throughout history. One of the pieces that really stood out to me was how Wedgwood uses pattern in their designs, and another is how William Morris turns patterns into wallpapers, both functional items giving the patterns context. More important research that helped shape the structure of my workshop were these two books, Print Workshop and Block Print. Both of these books talk up and teach a similar concept. In these books, they go through the different processes of how to cut and make block stamps and also touch on the different printing pattern techniques. One of the things I took from these books in particular is that it was a good idea for me to come to the workshop having templates for people attending that might struggle to come up with ideas. This will allow the workshop to be more productive and help me manage my time. Something I wish I had done for my workshops, if time had allowed, was to create a sheet of ideas on how to expand on the pattern making after the workshop. This is something I would consider when running more workshops. Here is the original didactic brief that I composed and then sent out over Teams so everyone could read before attending the workshop. This brief includes the objectives, the target audience, the time, date, location, important practitioner information and artist inspiration, and the expected outcomes. It also had a list of the materials and equipment and a note that I would be providing them for everyone. My contact information in case anyone had more questions, some additional information, and examples of how I've used what I will be teaching in the workshop in my own personal practice. There's also a glossary for some words that may not be in everyone's vocabulary. Here is the video I showed at the start of my workshop. This is something I changed and added to with every workshop I had. When doing my first practice workshop, I hadn't quite finished this and I used the workshop itself to add to the presentation. The practice workshop allowed me to understand what kind of time frame I will need to run a successful workshop. It also allowed me to put in the expected outcomes in the presentation for the future workshops. Here is the video of my practice workshop. The full video can be found on my YouTube channel. There is a link to that on my Padlet and at the assessment point. At the start of the workshop, I go through the PowerPoint presentation that I mentioned on the previous slides. I then show the participants how to carve the foam stamps. Once the stamps are made, I then go through the two pattern processes with them. Here are the final outcomes from my practice workshop. We did single prints together and then repeated patterns and then continuous patterns. And then finally at the end we collaborated together to make a repeat pattern using all of our stamps together. From having the experience of this practice test, I was able to determine how long I would need for future workshops. I was also able to reflect on the activities of the workshop and change them for the next one. When looking at the outcomes from the first practice workshop, I felt like the two pattern styles I had chosen to do were very similar, and I was afraid the participants might be bored or not really care for the differences between the two. This is why in my next workshop I plan on changing one of the patterns based on my experience. I have also included some feedback I got from the workshop here. There is more available on my Padlet. I wanted to keep the questions short, focusing on whether the participants enjoyed it and if they could now go off and do the activities on their own in confidence. Because I had changed one of the patterns in my workshop, I then decided it would be a good idea to do another practice. I wanted to make sure I was making the right decision by making these changes, and also it didn't affect the time. Again, the full video can be found on my YouTube and Padlet, and the link to the Padlet is at the start of the presentation and at the submission point. I did the same thing here and going through my now newly updated presentation. I did a small demonstration on how to create a foam stamp, allowing everyone to make the foam stamp before explaining the pattern making. I think this was the best way to teach the class, as it wasn't just a load of information at the start and we could break things up nicely. I didn't feel like this part of the workshop needed to be changed. At the start of each workshop, I always give the option of asking my participants if they would like to work solo or make a collaborative piece. In this particular workshop, we all decided to do a collaborative piece where we played Exquisite Corpse. I then went through after we made our stamps, we went through the different pattern processes. This time, rather than doing a continuous pattern, I chose to teach them how to do a random pattern. I thought this could be more exciting, and obviously there is a much bigger difference between the two pattern styles, as you can see in the final outcomes. At the top are the randoms, and then underneath are the repeats. The feedback I got for this workshop was that it was enjoyable and the instructions were clear and interesting and informative, and now that we'd have no problem making a stamp and creating the various patterns that we went through. Having gone through 2 practice workshops, I was ready to go through to my final one. I was really glad I'd made the change to which pattern I would be teaching during the workshop, as it gave it more variety and kept interest. Without my first practice workshop, I wouldn't have been able to reflect on this and change it. Here is the video for my final workshop. Using my past experiences, I did the workshop with the same formulas as before. I started by going through the final version of my presentation and then a small demonstration on how to carve the foam stamps. I also brought in the books that I had used to make my workshops, so participants could look at them and find inspiration. Unfortunately, I had 2 latecomers, so I had to go through my presentation twice more so they understand what they were doing throughout. I was worried that this would affect my timings. I hadn't had this experience during my 2 practice workshops, so it wasn't something I was prepared for. After everyone had created their stamps, I went through the different pattern making. Once we'd all created our patterns, I then hung them on the wall as a small collective. Like in previous workshops, I gave everyone the option to work as a collaboration or solo. This time they all chose a solo project. I also made templates for and explained how they could use them if they wanted to, but everyone created their own designs. The full video is on my YouTube channel. After everyone had created their stamps, we did single prints just to, to see if the stamps were how they wanted them, and we also stamped on like different mediums like the map. Use repeat patterns, as you can see here. This is the final outcomes for the workshop, as well as the physical stamps. Everyone was able to create a single print, and then everyone was able to follow the instructions and create the patterns as well. I then hung them on the wall as a mini collective. Here is some of the feedback I received from that workshop. There is more on my Padlet in the form of voice notes and messages. Looking back at the feedback I got from the workshop, I would say it was mostly successful. Everyone seemed to understand what they were doing and felt confident enough to be able to go away and use the skills they learned and to create a stamp and pattern. We also discussed on how they could put it into their own practice as well, which I think was really interesting. Me and Henry talked about how you could potentially like stamp onto photographs, as his specialism is like photography. So I think it was very interesting to talk to different practitioners about how they could incorporate the stamping into their own practice. Moving forward, evaluation and what's next. I feel like all of my workshops had an element of success to them. Each workshop, I asked participants to answer a few questions. I asked them if they would be able to leave the workshop and create a foam stamp, and then use the stamp to recreate the pattern and techniques that we had learned in the workshop. And in all of my feedback, everyone agreed that they could, go away and independently, with confidence, create their own stamp. With each practice workshop, I feel like I learned something new, and I was really glad that I did both of them, so I could change one of the patterns we'd learned. I thought that was very beneficial to the workshop and keeping interest. I didn't expect anyone to come late. It's not something I thought of when I was doing my practice workshops or anything like that, or when creating my workshop. So on reflection, I would create like a small cheat sheet for some people that are late. So rather than having to go through my entire presentation again, I could just hand them the cheat sheet and be like, this is what we're doing, so they could catch up in their own time, and I wouldn't have to like give them the attention that I could be giving to somebody else who like maybe potentially needed help. But overall, I would say that my didactic has been a success. The only thing I have struggled with throughout was, I feel like because there was a lot of prep, I feel like I struggled to record it as much on my Padlet as I'd liked. There is some stuff on there, but I feel like it's mostly in these presentations and the presentation that I gave at the beginning of workshop. I feel like most of the information is there. I also think, also in my Padlet, the fundamental research is in a section called fundamental research, because it was not only beneficial for my didactic, but it was also very beneficial for CPP. So that's something to consider when going through my Padlet. But overall, I am happy with the outcomes, and I'm happy with the feedback. And if I had had more time, creating some sort of like after workshop sheet could have been fun, like expanding on the patterns and things like that, and things to think about when making a stamp and like creating patterns. I think that would have been really beneficial. But again, that was if I'd had some time, and like on reflection, that is something that I would like to do in the future. So yeah, thank you.